Good afternoon. I'm Richard Seabass, the Dean of Engineering, University of Colorado Boulder. Pleased to welcome you to this second in a series of lectures on technology and responsibility. This series is co-sponsored by the Herbst Endowment for Humanities and Engineering and the President's Fund for Humanities. Last week, in the first of our series, we had as our guest Harvey Mansfield, the Thompson Professor of Government at Harvard. Harvey and the series host, Athanasios Moulakis, looked at professional education and the examined life. We learned that the examined life, at least as these two presented it, represented a familiarity, a deep familiarity with the good books, which should lead to at least a modicum of discomfort. This is the Mortimer Adler point of view, and I countered with the thesis that indeed that was a fine thing to know, but really one should wrap the good books into their historical perspective. My counter was not well received nor accepted, and something I found in my file today proves me wrong. In 1978, in a three-day series of debates held in Aspen, hosted by the columnist Bill Moyer, Mortimer Adler held forth on the third day the affirmative of the following thesis: that political democracy, supported and facilitated by a democratic society, will prevail everywhere and will survive and prosper. That was 1978. I don't think history would have helped predict the events in the last 2 years in Russia, but certainly Mortimer did, drawing solely upon the reasoning of Locke and not absent any historical context. So I stand corrected. I'm pleased now to turn you over to the host for this series, the Herbst Professor of Humanities for Engineers, Thanasi Moulakis. Thanasi?
Thank you and welcome to the series. I'm really delighted to greet you all here. And I'm also especially pleased that we could have the distinguished guests that we have today. The School of Engineering, as you all know, does a superb job of technical education, but we all know that that is not enough. We all know that technology is part of a whole, a natural whole, a human whole, a social whole. What our series seeks to do is to address explicitly what, in fact, most of my colleagues address implicitly, namely the context in which their efforts make sense, the context in which our technological education becomes truly valuable and meaningful. So what our series seeks to address is not only broader subjects, but also a broader public. The series is an offshoot of the Herbst Program of Humanities, which addresses a relatively small number of students in order to give them these broader perspectives. This series, the series on technology and responsibility, seeks to look beyond that and invites and hopes that it will stimulate the creation of at least a forum, if not a community of learning, in which broader questions can be discussed, in which various people from various corners of the university, and indeed we hope beyond, will be able to participate. We want to look beyond books, beyond mere books, and in any case the books, as valuable as I am myself persuaded they are only the middlemen. They are only the, how shall I say, the go-betweens. The important thing is the love that springs, and once it's there, then we can forget even about the books themselves. But looking beyond books, indeed, we are interested and we must face the moments where technology intersects with other realms and necessarily intersects with them, where it intersects with social concerns, where it intersects with enterprise, where it intersects with political decision, with ecological considerations, with international repercussions, in fact, with all these dimensions of human responsibility. I'm especially pleased today to be able to welcome two very distinguished guests. To say that Mercury is a guest is, of course, a strange way to put it. He belongs to this campus more than anyone else, perhaps. He is, of course, a graduate of this college and has been the recipient of the Distinguished Engineering Alumnus Award, and indeed of the highest distinction that the Alumni Association can confer, namely the George Nolan Award. He has been, how can one describe Mercure? How many hats of his can we actually mention? After a splendid career as an entrepreneur, which took him to the four corners of the world, he is one of the co-founders of Ball Corporation. He has returned to us, and he is the chair of the policy board of the optoelectronic computing unit, which is one of the most exciting things that our very exciting school pursues, and he is perhaps most pertinently for today's subject, director of our engineering management program. I'm delighted to be able to welcome our other guest, David Clare, who has come all the way from the East Coast to be with us today. Former executive vice president of Exxon Incorporated, has been president of Exxon Research before that, has been head of the European operations of Exxon before that, and in the course of that, I think perhaps, if I have understood him in previous conversations correctly, it is really on the basis of that he understood, or he pursued a fundamental rethinking of what it means not simply to carry on as you always did, steady as she goes, but rather to pick up a situation of difficulty and creatively rethink problems of management and interest. He is also a CU alumnus. He is also a recipient of the Distinguished Engineering Alumnus Award, and he was awarded last year, we are very proud to say, the Nolan Award of the University of Colorado. I give you David Clare.
Thanks, Thanasi. I always like crisp summaries. And I could start out by saying the responsibility of managers / leaders is simple. It's to empower employees. That's all. Now, I could sit down, which would leave a massive gap, so I probably won't. Otherwise, I might be fired by my host. And I need the money, see? But I think in retrospect, it may be worthwhile to put before you an actual case in which the theoretical concepts of managing and leading were blended, combined and tested on a real organization. And I think what involved was what I like to call a foundation for empowerment. Foundation built on discrete interlocking steps or components that can be used to enhance employee empowerment. And once you do that, organizational performance improves, and the bottom line is the results that organization achieves. Now, these components can be described in terms of content and process. They've certainly been used many times before in various organizations. However, they appear particularly effective as a total package. I like to call it a foundation. You might also call it a framework. But building that foundation is quite time-consuming. It's also very unpredictable, which demands extraordinary patience on the part of not only an organization, but particularly its leaders. If those leaders will take the time to build this kind of foundation, then the results will surely come, and they'll be in the form of employee spirit, motivation, productivity over the long term. Now, my confidence in this approach is really built on 8 years of experience, first in Europe as president of SOChem Europe, and then subsequently in Exxon Research and Engineering on this side of the Atlantic. It was really the experience at Exxon Research and Engineering that I'll dwell on today, because I think that's where the components really came together. Now, I would like to start with some definitions, because management and leadership may be misunderstood terms. I'll take the first chart there. They obviously overlap. Both of them are important. And because I feel that American companies tend to be overmanaged and underled, I'm going to be stressing the right-hand side of this. And of course, focusing on empower. And again, empowerment may be a misunderstood term. So let's at least give you my perspective on what empowerment means. I like simple charts, and especially ones without any units on them. On the vertical axis here, we have the extent to which individuals in an organization are aligned. And on the vertical axis, on the horizontal axis, we have the extent to which those employees feel they have freedom or even encouragement to act. Now, obviously, neither one of these extremes is proper. If you have all alignment, no freedom to act, you get a bureaucracy like we used to have in Russia and are still working our way out of. And if you have all freedom to act and no alignment, you'll get chaos. So what it takes is a strong blend of both of these to produce what I would call the vector on this chart, empowerment. Now, not everybody will define it that way, but that's a lot of what it amounts to. But to produce empowerment, there are these tangible components. And chart 3 will summarize the important ones. And I'm going to go over this kind of generally, and then I'll come back with some more specifics about the ER&E case. Well, here are the components. First, an organization should clarify its overall mission or purpose. Some would call this a vision of a desired future state. It's also useful for an organization to be clear about its values, because these strongly influence how people behave, how they relate to one another, and the overall tone of the work environment. Next, there's important goals which an organization wants to accomplish over a more finite period, and the general strategies it wants to follow to reach those goals. Now, all this sounds simple enough, but recognize that we want everyone in the organization to understand and be committed to the mission, the values, the goals, and the strategies. And this requires that those documents be drafted, debated, endlessly regurgitated with managers and employees at all levels, because it's in that discussion that the understanding really comes, and much is in between the lines. It also is important that once they're documented and distributed, that they be reinforced by everyone's actions and behavior. And if this is well done, individuals throughout the organization are not only going to be better aligned, but they'll have the competence to initiate and pursue actions that will move the company in the desired direction. Now, once understanding and commitment are obtained, there are a few people in the organization, maybe 10%, who know exactly what to do. They'll aggressively attack their area of responsibility and move it ahead. But to engage most of the people in implementing the organization's most important strategies, you have to roll out more structure, more guidance, and I think this is where the quality process comes into play. Now, the quality process, known by other labels, I think many of you are familiar with it, total quality management, the quality improvement process. It's been given form and substance by such pioneers as Deming, who got a Distinguished Engineering Alumni Award from Colorado and a degree, and also Joseph Juran, both octogenarians. They had a hard time getting the U.S. to listen. They sold their goods in Japan. The U.S. is finally listening. Quality provides a discipline method which can help organizations of all types, not just manufacturing organizations, organizations of all types, even educational organizations, continuously improve everything they do. I'll get back to quality in more detail later. Next on the chart is performance appraisal, counseling, and reward. Individual employee appraisal and feedback, as well as the organization's system of reward and recognition, must explicitly reinforce the values, the desired behaviors, and these same goals, these same strategies that have been documented and agreed by the organization. This is particularly important if a major cultural change is required. My definition of culture is the sum total of what an organization has been rewarded for. It has nothing to do with what the leaders write down on paper and preach. It's what they give rewards for. And the final item is training, or what I prefer to call continuous learning, and this also has to be hardwired to the mission, values, goals, and strategies. You can dissect each of those, look at the skills and knowledge that are required, find out the individual needs of employees, and then tailor training and learning to each employee's needs. Obviously, learning can be imparted in a number of ways. The formal classroom isn't the only one. Okay, with that quick introduction, let's get more specific about how this foundation was laid or evolved at Exxon Research and Engineering. I ought to tell you a little bit about the company. It has about, today, 2,800 employees. Has offices on both sides of the Atlantic. It's got three major elements. One is basic research or science, and then applied research and development, and then finally engineering, which really is the driving force for a whole range of capital projects around the world. In the mid-'80s, Exxon Research and Engineering was viewed as technically very skilled, but not particularly customer-oriented. The basic research organization seemed completely disconnected from their customers, which were the applied R&D organizations that take that science and apply it in research programs that will eventually make money. Even the general applied R&D work had shaky support from the business units. This was reflected, of course, in tight budgets, even declining budgets. That's the way they show their dissatisfaction. And in addition, falling oil prices in the early 80s had cut capital spending. Engineering's workload was truncated, I should say, probably cut in half. And as a result, the overall effect on ER&E was they went from 5,000 employees back in 1980 down to about 2,500 by 1985. Now you could say the brakes, but it wasn't the brakes. The customers were giving us a message. So ER&E presented a compelling case for change, and the change initiative started in late 1985 with a mission value statement eventually titled Directions. It set an overarching mission or goal for Exxon Research and Engineering, and that was to create opportunity and advantage for Exxon. Now, we could have constrained our statement of that mission to producing first-class technology for Exxon, but we opted to focus on output, then push on and focus on outcomes, which is profit. And that would force us into a more interactive relationship with our customers. In fact, we even started to call them partners. And of course, they were all in the same company, so a partnership was clearly possible and advantageous. Now, we developed directions in around four themes: innovation through partnership, the right technology, the right cost, and success through people. And by expanding on each of these themes, direction conveyed not only a desired way of working and a desired future state, but also a set of values which set the tone for ER&E's work environment and relationship among employees at all levels. Now, Chart 4 will summarize these values that you could extract from the direction statement. And I think as you read down them, you'll find that they're not too surprising. They'd probably be appropriate for almost any organization: manufacturing, service, and very importantly, continuous improvement, because almost every organization must do that. Now, it took about a year to put directions in final form, communicate it to all of ER&E's people, and say that we had done that segment of the job. The initial draft was done by the president and then extensively debated with ER&E's top management. Then this process continued down to the next level, and all the department managers got involved. And we started to bring in some of our customers, the Exxon business unit managers, so that they could also sign off on what was on paper. And the final product was in the form of a 3-color pamphlet to give it a little sense of permanence. And I would say that we developed the pamphlet before we started going to the organization. And we went to the organization in about 20-plus interactive sessions where they had a chance to read this and then go through a catharsis, which was to exchange with me and the relevant department manager, and this was a group of about 100 to 120 people, how they felt about it and what their general concerns were about the company. And they had a lot of concerns. And these were often very heated sessions lasting an hour to an hour and a half. There was no shortage of comments. Now, many employees still viewed directions as just another flavor of the month. It did have a fairly immediate impact on ER&E sensitivity to the customer, however. Immediately, we started to to hit some responsive chords with employees that, yes, that was a place we were weak. And also, the values implied in directions and the behaviors started to be practiced. Subtly, slowly at first, but eventually that all emerged. Now, in directions, we advertised an implementing initiative that was coming, and that was the quality process. And it was the quality process that really took directions out of the flavor of the month category, out of here today, gone tomorrow. So let's talk a little about quality now. Most companies who try to embrace the quality process as a way of working and managing learn that there's really no tailor-made product suitable for their case, and we found the same thing. We tried to find something more off the shelf. We went to a few consultants. We had a few disappointments with several of them. And in mid-'87, we settled down to developing our own quality process model, our own quality strategy, and the course content for training the workforce. Now, this was propelled by a quality manager, a new position we created reporting to the president, and by a quality council, which was our Exxon Research and Engineering Management Committee, and the quality council was chaired by the president as well. The model which evolved is shown on this chart. It focuses on creating loyal customers by fully satisfying their needs. And a loyal customer is kind of the middle range, I think. You know, you got satisfied customers, they like what you do for them. Loyal customers, they keep coming back. There's a third tier I like to think about too, and that's bragging customers. They like you so well, they'll brag about you. And how many of you brag about your cars? I mean, I brag about my Japanese car all the time. Now, the model also broke that overall goal into three subsets. One, establishing partnerships with customers so that we can understand, influence, and agree on customer requirements. And this can be for a product or service. The next component was analyzing and continuously improving all work processes so they not only meet the customer's needs, but that they're efficient as well. And then finally, and very importantly, creating and sustaining a work environment in which all employees can do their best. As Deming likes to say, managers work on systems, employees work in them. And if managers aren't spending their time looking for constraining systems and removing those constraints, they're not managing. And that's one lesson our people had to learn. Now, the key to getting this model accepted and put into practice was training. We started with a half-day awareness seminar, then developed a 2-day quality team training course, and finally a 4-day, what we call quality leadership course. Now, these last two broke the quality tools a slightly different way. We taught such things as negotiation and alignment, so you could discuss requirements with customers and also with team members, with colleagues. And we taught things like innovation and idea growing. It's very possible to not greet each new idea negatively, which is what most of us do. We see if it's bulletproof, but there are techniques you can teach to people that say, what do you like about it? How do you move it across your threshold from impracticality to practicality? That can be taught. Synectics built a whole company on it. Then we taught things like simple statistics, quality data tools, measurement, and what I guess we'd call team development. Now, all ER&E employees went through the awareness seminar. Now, essentially, all have gone through the 2-day quality team training course. And before they could do that, they had to get on a team that addressed some specific issue, opportunity, or problem. Only then could they take the quality team training. Then they trained as a team and they went back to the workplace to look at that problem or opportunity with quality process tools and techniques fresh in their minds. Now, quality leadership training had still more depth, and this was offered to highly committed employees who wanted to become quality team facilitators and also teachers of the modules within the training program. And we used employees to teach the modules. Employees at all levels, many managers, vice presidents, the president taught quality courses. And of course that deepens their commitment. And it tells the employees when they look up there at their boss and they say, gee, he's even teaching this, says something about his commitment. Now, quality process training was the crucial starting point, but we found that it took repeated reinforcing initiatives, and this involved looking at every problem that you reviewed and trying to use quality type terminology and thought processes as you reviewed it. And you couldn't just do the standard things, send the problem back. When you got an answer, come tell us and we'll review and comment on it. You had to ask other questions. What system or process is faulty? Now that you found the root cause, have you done something to that system or process so that root cause is repaired? And then finally, what have you done to put the process or system on continuous improvement? And those are questions that many managers never ask. Now, after the quality process had been in place, we started to see the initial skepticism evaporate as we got a few successes. And I would say that after about a year, we had a fairly long list of accomplishments which you would say had a common thread. Step change improvement. Cat-cracking pilot plant turnaround time reduced from 4 days to 1 day. Reforming pilot plant catalyst testing unit. Productivity increased 2.5 times. Engine cell setup time at products research reduced 60%. Those are real examples. We also found that the language of quality was creeping into the language of our people, even the ones who fought it. So you started to look for the symptoms, but believe me, it's not always obvious that you have to read tea leaves and vibrations. You don't find people jumping up and down. Well, at this point, we had the quality process moving forward. We had directions in place, somewhat accepted, but we still kept getting requests from our employees for a more explicit statement of where ER&E was going. What they really wanted was some comment about security, how big we were going to be in X number of years, and so on. Now, I resisted these for several months, generally indicating that directions and the tools and techniques of the quality process were enough. We didn't need any more than that. Well, I think they were sending me and the senior management two messages. One was, I think, diffused. The other was probably valid. The valid one was there's a gap between where direction stops and the specific strategies and plans of our individual departments take over, and that gap needs to be filled. That was the stated message. The unstated message, I think, was when you develop directions, you got a few people involved, 30 or 40, but you didn't involve all of us. And it was kind of laid on us like a stone tablet. And even though we agree with the words, our commitment is shaken somewhat because of the process you used. Now, I'm summarizing that, but that's the vibrations we got. So in developing the goals and strategies, we tried to respond. We still went top down. We still went through the layers of management, but we got to a level of about 100 first-line supervisors and senior technical people. And at that point, we made a decision to leave the goals and strategies in draft form for a year so that they could be taken through the various organizations to every employee, give everyone in the organization a chance to discuss them, get a feel for them, and hopefully build commitment. Well, at the end of the year, as the comments started to come in, and I continued to retain editorial responsibility, and I'll have to say I was astonished at the quality of what I got back. It was well digested, it was focused, and I would say there was considerable agreement among many of the commenters. And of course, the comments came to me by departments. But the biggest change was they wanted a shorter version that would have a longer shelf life. And so the fact that we produced that, and that was kind of a common request, made a lot of employees say, gee, they even listened to us. And the product we got was not only better, but I'm sure we had employee commitment that we wouldn't have gotten any other way. Now, the goals expanded on this mission of creating opportunity and advantage. And it did so by kind of a circular set of 4 goals. It said we want a greatly increased pace of innovation, and we defined innovation as ideas converted to results. Everybody can play. And also, it's usually measurable. We also had a second goal of leading industry in applying science and technology, and that meant inside as well as outside technology. A third goal was a high bottom line impact, and by that we meant profit. Those are the fruits of innovation. And then the final goal, successful people, successful organization, emphasized that enjoyment of your job, pride in organization, and motivation all follow from achievement and recognition. And in turn, if you get that motivation, it feeds the innovation, which is the first goal. So we had kind of a circular regenerative process in the goals. And the last goal became the title of this little booklet. Again, it covered the goals and strategies. And I've extracted here the strategies. I'll just let you read down them. Not too surprising for an R&D organization. The expansion of each of those in a couple of paragraphs isn't too surprising either. And I hope what you'll carry away is that the process is more important than the product. And the process is really what filled in between the lines of the product. You notice that quality is now positioned as a fundamental strategy of the company. Now, moving on to the next component of this foundation for empowerment, let's talk about appraisal, feedback, recognition, and reward. A place where academia is still in the dark ages, I think. Most companies have fairly formal systems for performance appraisal, counseling, rating, ranking, compensation. The key is connecting performance criteria by which the employees will be judged directly to all these things that people have agreed on, directly to the mission, the values, the goals, and the strategies. Connect it directly. And this means explicitly on the rating forms, in feedback and counseling discussions, in business meetings, in award ceremonies, and the many other formal and informal opportunities we all have to reinforce the values and desired behaviors of the organization. Actually, in ER&E, we use the quality process to produce an enhancement of performance appraisal and counseling. After we started to think of the employee as customer, it kind of dawned on us. We had gone to a lot of work, mission, values, goals, strategies, etc., to make it clear what the company expected of the employee. We didn't yet have a mechanism to find out what does the employee expect of the company in a structured way so it doesn't just get lip service, but it actually gets done. Ideally, we wanted supervisor and subordinate and even team members to discuss their respective individual requirements early in their relationship. And to stimulate such a discussion, we suggested a checklist of expectation categories. And I won't go through these, but they all go all the way from pretty hard things like, are you satisfied with the way jobs get picked for you? Or the level of responsibility you have? Are you getting enough coaching? All the way down to things that are pretty soft, like attachment, inclusion. I had a VP of corporate research who, on a scale of 1 to 10, on inclusion, I'm about a 0 and he's a 10. Well, it's very important we understand that. If he's home on Saturday alone, he goes to the mall because he can't stand that. It's very important to know that. So these requirements, and I put an et cetera because there are many more. And then if the discussion between individuals said our requirements aren't being met, we even defined what quality process would then say, well, what are the processes that are at fault if requirements aren't being met? And so this view graph operator is tremendous. I'm really following my script, aren't I? That these relationship processes really span the continuum of how work gets done and rewarded. First, employee work matching. That's a process. Preparing, guiding, training people to do work. That's a process. If somebody feels swamped, that process was failed, and they needed more training and preparation. Monitoring, facilitating, adding value as work goes on. Converting a work product to an achievement, often outside the employee's control. Assessment and feedback, reward and recognition. Each of those are processes. And we wanted to encourage supervisors and subordinates to look at them that way, find their weaknesses, and repair them. Another interesting side benefit of this, if you think about it, is managing diversity. Because what's really difficult in managing diversity is getting the people to talk about individual needs. Most minority groups that I talk to say we don't want to be treated specially. I agree with that. And this approach treated everybody the same. But in the process, you got a lot of discussion about diverse groups and hopefully improved treatment. Let me finish the 5 components with training. In many companies, this is very ad hoc, disconnected. But once you've got your mission and values, goals and strategies in place and documented, and you've got a strategy implementation approach like quality, and you've got standards for discipline, performance appraisal, and counseling, you've got the basis for a very well-connected training approach. In ER&E, we took each of those components and dissected them and said, what are the skills and knowledge employees need to meet our expectations? And we had a checklist of some of these. These are some of the types of skills we were thinking through that would probably be required by an employee. And then we had another list of knowledge elements. And again, most organizations would compile a very similar list. But once you've got the individual's needs on the table, and you can start to say, well, where are the deficient skills and knowledge, then you can actually prepare training maps for each individual employee and start to program how this really ought to work. And I've shown on this final chart, well, next to the final one, some delivery vehicles. If we know what skills and knowledge we want to teach or we want the employees to learn, we don't sit them down in the classroom and teach them. There are all these different ways that people can absorb information, acquire skills, acquire knowledge. Many of them are on the job. And this is the kind of thing I keep preaching at the Engineering Development Council. We got to learn to do more than one thing at once. We've got to be able to do work and learn at the same time. Now, if you combine then these, I'll go to the final view graph here, and this is kind of a segment of a training map. You've got some deficient skills and knowledge for a given employee. You've got delivery vehicles you've chosen as optimum to impart that skill or knowledge. Then you write in the blanks when and what delivery vehicle did you choose. And then you've got a program, a training program for each employee. And we did this on a 3-year time scale, and we had similar things for their technical skills. But these I'm just touching on more the empowerment-related skills that I've been discussing. Now, the payoff for all this, you're saying, this took a lot of time and effort. It sure did. But if you now look at ER&E, questionnaires and surveys of customers clearly say that they're now valued contributors to the business. Another good measure is budgets. The budgets have been increasing for 6 years. Employee workforce has been increasing for 6 years. More work is coming their way. That's how you decide if you're successful. The stock went up, the morale and motivation of the employees have strengthened, but I still would say I think they're still just shadows of what they'll eventually become as this continues to play out over time. So, let me summarize. My experience in 2 different organizations on both sides of the Atlantic has convinced me that the following are generic keys to full empowerment. A participative alignment initiative to agree on the organization's mission, values, goals, and strategies. A facilitating structure such as quality that encourages and engages most employees in moving the organization in the desired direction. Performance appraisal and counseling, and rewards that are explicitly tied to these same agreed values and desired behaviors. Individualized training and learning that is tied directly to both employee needs and the mission, values, goals, and strategies of the organization. Then you need a broad framework of support. Everybody has to walk the talk, especially the managers, the senior managers. And you need a group of managers that relentlessly press for this culture, that they don't just play the game, that they really believe in it. And we had some that couldn't do that, and they had to find other jobs. And then I think, very importantly, is a recognition that most organizations have one opportunity per decade, maybe per generation, to put something like this in place. So you have to be patient, you have to do it right. Now, I might add a postscript. It's important to realize that whenever you're changing an organization, there's a hard and a soft side of change. The hard side are the specific things you want to accomplish. But the soft side is how the employees are reacting to that. What are their needs as they try and absorb and become a part of this change? And I'll have to say that a skilled organizational effectiveness advisor and the quality manager and I spent more time together than any 3 people in the organization, because those 3 had to work together closely. But just as critical is a small core of champions that emerge from all levels of the organization. They seem to grasp the concepts quickly, just like in most classes you're in. They see the benefits early. They support and lead the initiatives. And most importantly, they take the risk that they're not riding a fading horse, because that could surely be the case. So in the final analysis, I think the credit for full empowerment at ER&E belongs to this sort of person. They're really the leaders. And I think every CEO of every organization in this country ought to be laying awake nights trying to figure out how to exploit their commitment, their capability, and their power.
Thank you very much, David Clare. Mark here, would you please respond before we open the floor to the questions?
Well, my remarks here are probably less in terms of a response, because I just have to say Dave is preaching to the choir as far as I'm concerned. Well, what I'd like to talk a little bit about from a perspective of an unfrocked business executive, actually, who has some educational responsibilities now, is the implication of what David just walked through to education, especially engineering education. Because David was talking about a high-class engineering organization, a high-class technical organization. And I think it's worthwhile for us to reflect on what does that really mean in terms of educating engineers. But before I do, I want to make a couple comments that I think this is a great forum to do it in. The topic of this series is, I think it is at least, technology and responsibility. And to me, this is an interesting topic. Because typically, and I don't know how many of you people sitting out there would react to this, but I suspect people reading the little brochure will say, aha, how do the technologists become more responsible? What do we have to do to get these engineers to be responsible? And I would say to you that the technologists alone cannot be the responsible party. This business of responsibility and technology is a two-way street. And because it's a two-way street, there are responsibilities on both sides. And by this I'm talking about, the sides I'm talking about are the technically educated scientists, the technologists, the scientists, the engineers, the technically educated, and then all other people, the lay people, if you want to look at it that way. And there is a responsibility that I would say society has here to educate our lay people to a point where they have some appreciation of what technology is and isn't, some appreciation of the limits of technology. And coming back to what David said indirectly at least, an appreciation for what is now being called variation, Deming's term variation. I'd submit to you that most educated people and probably I could just say period, forgetting whether they're technologists or not. But let's give the technologists a break here. Most educated lay people do not have the foggiest conception of variation. And this is probably one of the most important concepts today in our society that people ought to have some feel for, because we are perpetually, bombarded by catastrophes, which in some sense is just a natural outcome of the system, of the variation that's inherent in the system. But yet our legislatures, our lay public, all are looking at these things as really from the wrong end of the telescope. In any complex society that is dependent upon complex technologies and complex processes, that society ought to have some feel for what is the expected variation in the performance of these. And this very basic understanding is totally lost in 9/10 of our population. And until we can educate some of our lay people, and this education has to be started, I believe, in the elementary and high schools, not left only for the universities, because few of our people ever end up at the universities. Until we do this, we technologists, I think, are facing a losing battle. The other side of this street, however, this street that we walk on, we have a responsibility as educators, as technologists, and that responsibility, I think, is not well covered. I think here at the University of Colorado, probably better than most, we're making strides. But there is an obligation on us as educators of technologists, and I use the word technologist so I don't have to fuss with whether you're a scientist or an engineer. We have an obligation, which I think Thanasi tries hard to deliver on, to expose our people to the non-technical aspects of the outside world. And this is not a comprehensive list, but I would say some of these non-technical aspects of the outside world would include ethics and morality. Almost every technical question that we see today is somehow contained in a context of ethics and morality. The environmental movement is a good example of this, but I could quote you numbers of others. The medical profession is an example, the delivery of drugs, etc. We need to educate our technologists in the social context in which they're going to operate. And I would say to you, this is very important because now we're in a global economy and the social contexts are different. We can't talk just now of the social context in the United States. We have to talk about the social context of our global competitors. And a fascinating thing to think about is the social context that's undergoing change in the Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and what effect will that have? And another example of what I think we as educators need to inculcate into our students, and that is the concept of value. Now, Dave touches on this a number of places. Now, I'm not going to try to define value, except I'm going to point out that value is not gain necessarily. And we too often confuse value for gain. Or let's put it another way. We too often confuse gain for value added. And we need to be able to point out to the technologists that there is a real difference between value and gain. Now, if you take Dave's example, now I believe this deeply. If you have the right sets of values and you can deliver value in your enterprise, gain will occur. Gain will naturally fall out of this, but the reverse is not necessarily true. Now, this is just a quick overview of some of these things that dwell on responsibility. And I suspect most of you in the audience could say to yourself, well, we don't do a very good job of this. In some cases, we don't even expose our students to some of these things. As an aside, would you look through and pick up the third foil of Dave's? In a little bit, I'll need that, because I want to come back to this. And this is important. The subject matter that Dave Clare went over is a how-to-do-it case. I mean, here's a recipe in a sense. But this recipe contains ingredients that are hardly touched upon, and I would say touched upon neither in the business schools of the United States in general, nor the engineering schools. But we are now, I think, starting to be governed by what I would call the imperative of competitiveness. And unless we respond to this imperative, we are going to find that society is going to figure out different solutions. If we as educators cannot respond to this enormous drive right now, especially in this country, to not only to remain competitive, but oftentimes to become competitive in a global economy, don't forget that as a public institution or as a private institution, or if you're in a government laboratory or whatever, the wherewithal for your activities comes from the ability of the United States private sector to survive, and not only survive, but to prosper. And unless we collectively can put together programs that respond to this imperative, our system is going to find other places to find those things. And we, I think, as educators, turn our back on this at our peril. And again, something Dave said, I think, is something very important for the educational system, as well as, say, in technology, the governmental laboratories as well, is to ask ourselves, do our reward systems really align ourselves in our endeavors to what this imperative of competitiveness is asking of us? And my suspicion is, if you really are honest, you'll say no. You will say that we need some work on this, and this is going to be very difficult, I believe. Well, let me go on. Managers in a technologically based company or enterprise, let's use the word enterprise, really face two masters. And it's a little bit different than managers in a non-technical enterprise. And these two masters, I would submit to you, are first the organization's stakeholders. And I use the word stakeholders because it is a broad term now that has some currency. But the second master, and it's a difficult master, is the technology itself. And this is one thing that tends to set aside or set apart technologically based organizations from all others, is that not only do those organizations have the same types of problems that all other organizations, and the problems that Dave addressed, I think, eloquently here, in terms of motivation, in terms of alignment, etc. But over and above that, all of that empowerment, all of that alignment, etc., that David is talking about is set in a context of technology. And the managers of these enterprises, to be responsible, have to respond to both of these masters. The needs and values and expectations of the stakeholders are varied. And again, we as a country are having difficulty understanding how to meet these needs. If you're on a board of directors of a corporation, your legal responsibility, the responsibility that you get sued for if the shareholders and other people decide you're not doing your job, is strictly to the shareholder. Strictly to the shareholder if you're a director of a public organization, publicly held company. Yet management's responsibility runs not only to the shareholders but to a host of other stakeholders, the employees notably, the suppliers, the community in which they operate, the creditors, a host of different, and I would say the public, society in general, a host of different needs, expectations, values that the manager of a technologically based company as well as a non-technical company has to somehow balance, has to somehow fit together in a puzzle in our country to balance these and yet return the profit to the shareholders that they expect. Whether the shareholders are public or whether they're private is really beside the point in that instance. Not only that, in the modern form of enterprise, especially the public corporation that we see in the United States, I believe, I don't know whether David would agree with me on this or not, but I believe that one of the overpowering responsibilities of management is to ensure the viability and the longevity of the organization. Because without that, you have no way to sustain the economy, to sustain the needs, the lives of the employees, unless you can view the enterprise as having, I don't want to say a perpetual life necessarily, but a long life. And that responsibility is heavy because in order to do that, the manager has to respond today in very, very fast changes in the environment. Not only changes in public tastes, but also very fast changes in legislation. Just think for a moment how quickly our banking system has changed because of essentially deregulation, or what a vast change the air transportation industry in this country has undergone because of a relatively simple legislative edict that says you are not now going to be controlled. Now, in order to survive in a technically oriented company, the managers of that organization have to understand the technology and the bounds upon which that technology or technologies place on the enterprise. I'll give you a couple examples. The company I was associated for a number of years, Ball Corporation, started out as a glass container company and prospered. Yet, had that corporation not become very knowledgeable in technology based on aluminum and forming aluminum into, in this case, cans, they would be a far different organization today because the technology embedded in glass could only go so far. For one thing, glass is not easily recyclable. It's not viewed necessarily by today's public as an environmentally good packaging material. And this is a boundary that is placed upon an organization by the technology that it owns and that it holds. And so consequently, to be responsible in what I would say the full sense of managerial responsibility, which means to be socially responsible, to be able to ensure the longevity of the organization, that the manager of a technical enterprise has to understand where that flow is going and how that enterprise can utilize the technologies, or how it must, if it has to, obtain new technologies to carry on. The other thing about this, I think, that is very important, and I think, again, we fail to inculcate this into our students in engineering or science, and that is this. The misuse of a technology, sooner or later, will be discovered. And sooner or later will have catastrophic effects upon those that misuse the technology. It might take a long time, but sooner or later, if a technology is misused, that will be discovered and you will pay a heavy penalty. Could I just have that third slide of Dave's for a moment? I want to make a point here. This slide talks about foundation for empowerment. And Dave's company was a highly technical company, but I defy you to find anything, look up here and see anything that has a heavy technology component, except possibly the quality process, but even then I'd argue that that's a bit of it, but not all of it. All of this thing that Dave has talked about in this slide is almost never touched upon in our education. And yet, we expect our students to go out of this institution and be able to comprehend something like this, to be able to fit into it, but probably more importantly, you'd like those people to be the agents of change that Dave talks about, to be the champions of change. But yet, we are not giving them these tools. We're giving them marvelous technical tools, but we are giving them almost no exposure to the things that impact this list. And somehow, again, because of this imperative for competitiveness that I talked about, somehow I think we as educators have got to find time, the ability to put these sorts of things somehow into our curriculum. Because I believe if we don't, we're going to find that the marketplace, our customers, are going to go somewhere else. Because I think this sort of thing that Dave pointed out is something that is fundamental that's going to happen in this country over many, many different companies. And those that don't probably will not survive. So let me come back to the role of engineering education or technical education in all of this. And I think, first of all, we have to sensitize our students to these kinds of issues, which are not technological issues. But I would say this, you cannot expect the business schools or the arts and science schools to do this for you, because these things are embedded in our business in technical organizations. So we have to be able to help our students understand these issues. And I think, importantly, we have to inculcate into our students, if we expect them to come up to be responsible and to be developed into responsible, maybe not managers, but responsible individuals, we have to inculcate into them a value system that transcends the values of the technology. Because this is what this is all about, is putting together a new value system in an organization. And so we as educators, I think, have a responsibility and a duty to assist by turning out people that are at least exposed to this sort of thing. We are not doing a good job on that. Let me say one other thing, and that is, Dave talked about satisfying the customer. This is the whole big thing about the quality process. But I would say to you that there is a fallacy contained in this. There is a fallacy of satisfying the customer. That fallacy is this. Ishikawa, who is a well-known Japanese quality man, says, you must satisfy, the customer is king, but sometimes the king is blind. And it is the responsibility of management and of the technologists to fulfill the customer's needs in a responsible way. The customer may not always understand what the responsible way to fulfill his or her needs would be. Certainly you can see all kinds of evidence of that. If you just place your system, your quality system, on the rock of satisfying the customer's needs blindly, here again, you will, I believe, not be responding to the needs of society, certainly not in a responsible way. Therefore, if you believe this, another imperative of management here is that management has to be able to align the delivery of those goods and services to those customers, align that delivery to the proper value that the customer is receiving, and to have the responsibility to make that delivery aligned with the proper needs and responsibilities inherent in that delivery system, and not blindly follow just, quote, the needs of the customer. Now, I think the last thing I'd say as a response to what Dave has said is this. We're talking about responsibility. Management, whether it be management of large or small companies, but the private sector management has a deep responsibility, in my view, to insist that the education of the technologists that are being delivered into society have this kind of component. That the universities must be made to recognize in their curriculum the central role that these non-technical issues play in today's society, the central role which they play in competitiveness today. And it is a responsibility of the managers, of the executives, because after all, they, in a sense, their organizations provide the fuel that runs, say, our institution. And they have a responsibility to demand and to ensure that the institution responds in a way that their graduates can come into an organization and understand and feel comfortable about something like this, or perhaps more importantly, can lead an organization into this path. And I think if we can do that, not only will our institutions survive and prosper, but we also probably can get a little more pride in what we do. The last thing I'd say to leave you is all of this kind of rolls up into this one idea that Dave talked about, that Deming talks about incessantly, and that is continuous improvement. You can't do all this in a day, and sometimes you can make these enormous steps that Dave talks about. But the real key to all of this, whether you're in an educational institution or whether you're in, say, a private laboratory or whether you're in commerce and industry, is to inculcate the feeling that we naturally strive to do things better all the time. We naturally strive to improve what we do. We naturally strive to improve the course content. We naturally strive to improve our processes. We naturally strive to improve the quality of our research, etc. And to start to inculcate this into our students as well, so that they go out and say, well, you're not doing it? My heavens, I think I'll find a company that understands what's going on in the real world. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your most suggestive and indeed wonderfully complimentary presentations. And I have just one or two remarks to make, if I may, before I ask you all to put your questions to our speakers. I was very struck by a number of things, but especially by the simple graph that David Clare showed us with the two axes of freedom to act and alignment. What struck me is how much this is really like what we try to do when we educate. That is precisely that if you take the alignment axis to be the subject, if you take it to be the canon, if you take it to be the tradition, if you take it to be the stuff, it is just that. It is essential, because otherwise you're lost. But if it's all you do and all you concentrate on, you get pedantry. If, on the other hand, you allow everything to collapse onto the axis of freedom to act, you end up with what is euphemistically called student-centered teaching, which is to say the touchy-feely stuff, was to end up with simply minds of mush. And Whereas if you are able to refer freedom to act to a proper material, which allows for precision, for activity, what you get is indeed empowerment. And it is our business, I think, and that is often, I think, misunderstood, not to stuff people's minds, but to make ourselves superfluous. And I think that exactly those two axes show the balance that needs to be struck. So, but I'm very struck by the analogy between what happens in an organization that is devoted to different goals and what happens in the academic world, or what should happen in the academic world. What is also very striking is, I think, the strange, and that was true, I think, of both speakers, how shall I say, imprecise relationship between what are the true goals and the way in which rewards reflect goals that are different than those that are proclaimed, and establishing what really is that which should be rewarded, and finding ways of evaluating what is that ought to be rewarded seems to me, again, one of the problems that we experience daily in the structures of university life, whether it is teaching versus research, whether it is whatever it is. It is also, I think, a great boon to hear that the language of quality is what one is looking for, even in fields where the layman would suspect that paring down, as it were, making the product cheaper, is what one might have expected, that is not the way to get ahead. And that, I think, is a fortiori the case in an educational enterprise, where the only way to go is upmarket and not down. This brings me to the remarks of Mercure, who I think the key word there was one of the first things he said, namely the appreciation of limits. I think one of the most wonderful things, actually, for someone like myself who comes from a non-technical background, to find himself among people with a technological background, I use it in Merck's sense of not distinguishing between technology and science for the sake of simplicity, is that it is not at all like the layman imagines. That it is, in fact, a much more conscious, much more reflected, and much more value-informed milieu than the average, how shall I say, humanist ideologue would like to believe. But there is something which is very difficult, and I think it is that this impression from the outside is a bit the price one pays, the price the technologist pays for the prestige that she enjoys. That is to say, that the rhetoric of technology is what has made it so powerful socially. A scientist said, the great new works are going to fix it. And there is, of course, a science fiction dimension to that. It's the kind of confidence of an H.G. Wells, except so in his even he discovered that wasn't true at the very end of his days. This confidence that the problems that the imperfection of human existence keeps putting before us will have the one big technical fix. And that is, I think, it's the people who actually work technical things know is not the case. It is exactly they who are the first to recognize those limits. But the thing is that the prestige of the whole operation operates on this endless promise, on the absence of limits. So it is something which, if we can bring out to the general public as well as to those who are involved in themselves in technologically inclined pursuits, would be a wonderful thing. I mean, the same is true of science, for instance. I think that the non-scientist believes in the marvelous certitudes of scientific work, which, of course, any practicing scientist knows is not the case, except perhaps for some kinds of mathematician. So, again, I'm coming back to the notion of the education of the king. I think we all have a duty to open up to each other and face the limits and make the best of it with all the means at our disposal. Gentlemen, again, thank you very much.
Why is it, Mark and David, that we learn about these things from engineers? Can our students come to the College of Business Administration and learn what we've been hearing today? And there are faculty from that school present, at least Claude McMillan is here, to defend
Well, I think
the
it-
business and
I don't
administrative
know,
curriculum.
in a sense, I think they face the same quandary we do. They have a lot of hard subject matter. They want to teach accounting and finance and so on and so forth, and they feel their curriculum is chock-a-block, just like the engineers need to teach thermo and plan design and double E, and, you know, and they say, we just don't have time to introduce all of these things. And that's why I think, you know, whenever I have a job around the house where I can do two things at once, you know, I've dug a trench and I need some dirt somewhere else at the same time. So that's a job I'll do first, because it does two things at once. Well, in a sense, that's what the new teaching learning paradigm has to do. It has to realize that the customers are not satisfied. First, the students I talk to at this university and elsewhere think teaching at the undergraduate level is mediocre. They think counseling and advising is poor when it's done at all. The business community thinks that there's all kinds of new things that ought to be taught. And in fact, Bill Wainwright is an instructionally enhanced internship program that tries to realize that and do something about it. Well, if we would look at those customers and say, we really need to think about this, and then we look internal customers, how many customers of internal processes and systems within the university are thoroughly satisfied? I hear them complain all the time. This is a burden, that's inefficient. Well, you have some dissatisfied customers internally. So what you have to do is you have to think about all those customer demands that aren't being met and say, is there a teaching learning paradigm that'll deliver the subject matter and do those things at the same time? Dig out the trench and use the fill. That's the challenge. It can be done. I'm absolutely confident that we can teach teamwork while teaching subject matter. I'm absolutely sure we can teach leadership while teaching subject matter. We can teach people about how business organizations function to make a profit and teach some subject matter. I know it can be done, we just haven't decided.
Right, it
that
is true, and in the business of teaching teamwork, the system is not one that's simply not broken, needs continuous improvement, it's actually broke.
Yeah,
The
well,
whole educational paradigm is individual competition.
Yeah.
And we are trying to do many things to address that, but I think it's a very good point.
May I make a comment on this? One of the things that I think you are always struck with when you start to look through the modern practice and theory of quality that Dave was talking about is that the process that is put in place tends to break down organizational barriers. It tends to make those lines blurred. The differentiation, the hard differentiation of responsibilities between marketing and engineering and production, as an example, tend to get more diffuse because the process forces a much closer cooperation and linkage. And I would say that same sort of thing, if it could be applied to the classical university in a sense that could break down this very rigid structure of classical departments, that this department has this particular function and that department, or schools and colleges for that matter, that is very difficult to deliver what Dave is talking about, in my view at least, with a system that is very, very rigid in terms of the boundaries of the organizations.
And I think a specific example along those lines, which again I'll draw out of ER&E, we had an elapsed time between when an engineer said that report is finished and sent it off to be printed or whatever happened to it, and the time that it actually got in the hands of a customer, an affiliate, so that something could be done with it, was 17 to 21 days. And there were a lot of affiliates who'd hear about it and be very interested in applying the results, and they couldn't get the specifics. And so a team went to work on that. And just as Mert points out, that team was very diverse, and they first started thinking, well, these are all the interested parties. They sat down to flow chart the process, a good first step whenever you're applying quality principles. They found out from their first flow chart they couldn't even do it. They didn't have all the people in the room that understood the complexity of the process in total, so they added to the team. And pretty soon they had them all in the room. Then they could flow chart it. And the makeup of that team came from about 8 different departments. But still, they analyzed all the recycles in the system, in the process, devised ways to improve it, and then they cut it from 17 to 21 days down to 10, subsequently to 7. And I think what you'll find is that their approach to continuous improvement was don't disband the team. Let's keep meeting once every month or so and see if we've done all we can on this. So they had to meet that test of continuous improvement. How are you going to make sure this process is continuously improved?
Okay, I have one question for R.C. McCure and one question for David Clare. Is that okay? It's kind of
Please.
questions.
It's democratic.
All right. First question for R.C. McClare is you mentioned that there are times you have, say, the king, the customer is king, and sometimes the customer is blind. Now, how exactly do you say help this blind king without losing revenue to your competitor? I mean, it sounds like a noble idea. You know, you have to be responsible. But say if you slack down on giving something dangerous to your customer, will your competitor do it anyways? And the question for David Clare was, when you had your pamphlets, Directions, I believe that's the name of it, I noticed that you spoke of a great deal of having the upper managers, middle managers, and lower management in the construction. My question is, what was the construction from the employees, because they seem to be the most affected by it?
Yeah, and that was the point I made, is that Directions didn't go deep enough in the organization, and we sensed that from its acceptability, even though no one would say, I don't agree with the words. It's something deeper than that. And that's why in the Goals and Strategies introduction, we took the extra year and took it to all the employees. You learn things all the time. The techniques I applied in Europe, and in a much more diverse organization. I mean, we had 17 different nationalities all over Europe. Much easier to get them aligned than Exxon Research and Engineering. And you say it's just different character of organization. How much have they been beat up? How cynical are they at this point? How distrustful? Those are all factors. But I think this soft side of what makes people want to do their best is what we've dwelled on. You know, what is it that really gets to them? And all of you know, when you've been in a high-performing group, it's quite an exhilarating experience. Yet you don't stay in high-performance gear all the time. But if we could just get you in that gear 20% of the time, God, what productivity is here? And I've seen it happen. What people can accomplish is astounding. And coming back to our academic parallel, I think what we'll find is that when we quit playing Ain't It Awful on all the base work we have to do, and therefore don't have time to innovate and invent, then we'll be on the track. As we did this at ER&E, all kinds of marginal work had to quit getting done. I had to spend 50% of my time on this. Well, I still had to make the same reviews with Exxon and all that sort of stuff, but the employees help you do those things easier and better. And marginal work just somehow works its way out of the system, which is what you want. And I think the administrative burdens in academia would change character quite a bit if you tackled something like a new teaching learning paradigm. They'd have to. You just don't have time to go to work on that and keep all the other junk going at the same time. But you'll find that that junk that you eliminate was what you needed to streamline out of the system anyway.
Let me respond to the question you asked me. I'll respond by giving you an example or an analogy, first of all. The great contribution that the Japanese automobile manufacturers made to to the technology was to prove that quality could inherently be high while costs can come down. And I think that's a good example of satisfying the customer's need when the customer himself or herself may not understand or know what it is. They may have some vague feeling of unease, but a lot of the things that we now can see that are capable, that we can do, are based upon this, the breaking the fallacy that quality or doing something right in its full context is necessarily expensive. And it's not, I think the trick here is not to say to yourself, if I have to do this in the right way, it's necessarily going to be more expensive. I'm not saying you can do that all the time. But the point is that I think we now understand that we can deliver things now today that have higher quality in however you want to put it, not only just customer satisfaction, but say less environmental impact, if you want to think of it that way, with not necessarily increasing costs. If you do it with understanding, with cleverness, and things like this. If you've ever gone through something like this, you find the enormous amount of capability that is embedded in the organization that is almost untouched.
And I think the key word in establishing these customer needs, and I think influencing them is an obligation of the supplier as well, is the partnership with the customer. You have to have enough dialogue to really, on the one hand, understand what's possible, on the other hand, understand what's needed. So when Products Research was talking to the Exxon marketers about possibilities for gasoline additives, they have to give the customer some idea of what might be possible, because the customer isn't necessarily going to invent that in his own mind. So I think it's that interaction, that partnership, that really gets you where you want to be. And I think if you can just narrow that gap, and I think you find the Japanese system driven to single supplier relationships, because the Deming says you just don't have time to educate more than one supplier and work with them in the proper way. Well, there's a lot of purchasing agents go ghastly white when you say that, because they're used to beating suppliers over the head with the strength of competition from others. But there's a lot of truth in it.
I'd like to speak to the need, and to those of you involved in academia, I am one of the angels that Merck said David was preaching to. I am a believer in this process, but to my knowledge, I deal in a much smaller company atmosphere, and I'm involved with many, many small companies, anywhere from 50 people to 500, that sort of thing, not their size. And I think from my experience, there may be only 10% of American companies that are believers today, certainly a minority. Then you go within the companies that are practicing what David has done, and inside those companies you have maybe 10–20% human believers, 60% show me or drag me along, and maybe another 10–15% of saboteurs who love to be dictators in their own little office or wherever they are. Now, the question I have for academia is that what you trained us to do when we were in school? And I tend to believe that the educational system in our country, from the bottom to the top, has created this dilemma, and it is your job to help change it.
Well, that's a deep subject, Clancy. One we'll devote the next day to. But just to quote a friend of mine, the honest truth, I'm afraid, may be that cemeteries and universities are equally likely to self-reorganize.
And I think, again, it's going to have to be a multifaceted attack. And maybe maybe the way that universities feel the edge of competition is enrollments go down because some universities start doing this better. Right now, when I talk to groups about this new teaching learning paradigm, again, you get a lot of agreement. Everybody says, yeah, that's what we need, but we just don't have time. And besides, the real problem is the public schools. I mean, higher education's in good shape, and relatively it is. But nevertheless, continuous improvement could take hold here too.
Both of you gentlemen used the same slide to talk about appraisal, counseling, reward, goal setting, mission values, training. I think I got most of them that you had up there. I wore a blue suit in an Air Force Research Lab for a couple of years, so I guess I worked for an organization that put a lot of resources into those items. I won't debate whether or not they did a good job. I've also worked for a couple of Boulder County computer software startups where the amount of resources put into those items are just about nil. And the planning horizons of a small company, I think, typically are a lot shorter. Typically, you may be looking maybe 5 years out. You may be looking to the next quarter to see if we can break even or not. How do you, and the problem I think of small companies typically is very difficult to say, once again, to quote the often quoted phrase here, we don't have time. But I almost feel like some of these things you said are perhaps even more important in a small company for their survival than they are in a big company, even more so perhaps in the short term. How do you balance the need to spend that management time? You mentioned, sir, that you spend 50% of your time involved with it. How do you balance that management time when you're struggling to bring in those revenues, you know, so you can be in the black the next quarter? And is there a stage where, as you progress from a startup to a small company, in the computer business we call it a scrambleware company, and then you become a software company as you progress? Is there a stage there where you go through different levels where you absolutely have to implement something like this to be efficient?
Well, I kind of agree with your first point, is it's just as necessary in a company of two. I was going through the diamond market in Antwerp one time, and I noticed in this particular 50-man house that people were all smiling, running around, looked genuinely happy. And I asked the proprietor, you seem to have a good feel around here. What do you attribute that to? And he says, instant reward. He says, when I see someone who's done a good job, this is my business, my company, I lay $1,000 on them right across the table. And he says, that's instant reward. Well, that's one technique. But there are, again, I think what you'll need to do more of as you get bigger is add structure so that it's done uniformly, so that everybody kind of gets the same treatment. In a small company, that guy himself was the custodian of uniformity. He kind of judged what each contribution was worth based on his bank account and handed out some part of it. But I think in a larger company, you can't do that. Start to create more problems. So you then add structure. And I think that's it's not that you want to take it on after you get to a certain size. I think when one person's supervising one person, there's an obligation to appraise performance, counsel, and try and make both of you better. When we introduced this quality in the individual, as we called it, we said, now here's an arena where the employee and supervisor are on a level playing field. They're looking at the work that needs to be done. They're thinking about their personal requirements as it gets done, and they're discussing with no subordinate supervisor, the subordinate or the supervisor having any greater priority on getting their needs satisfied. It's up to them to work out a way that satisfies both their needs. And I think, obviously, you can never exactly have a level playing field, but you know many relationships where you can talk openly and candidly and get a lot on the table quickly. What you try and do is say, we expect that to happen. And sometimes you have to put some structure in that says, document it, so we know it's happened. Because many times people say, oh yeah, I do that. But you go talk to the subordinate and ask him, when did you have your last good performance appraisal and counseling session?
What's that?
They say, oh, I don't know, 25 years ago or something like that.
You're doing a good job. Thank you.
Let me respond to you, too, in another vein. one of the perplexities, I think, of this whole thing is that small companies should have a decided advantage to do this. Because in a small company, 30 people, you know, you can get every, well, maybe not every employee, but the majority of the employee sitting down in front of you and talk with them easily. I mean, communication in theory in a small company ought to be just slick as a whistle. In practice, it rarely is. But one of the problems of a small company, especially like you talk about, I've been associated with software companies and small hardware companies, is the fact that I would suspect that the founders of that company didn't have a clue about what Dave was talking about. How would you expect them to do something? They don't even know about it. You know, I would venture to say you walk over to our computer engineering people or our computer science people and say, what do you know about Deming? And they'll look at you and say, well, I don't know. Now, I'm not damning that. I'm just pointing out that typically the people who start up companies, especially technically based companies, are the products of our institutions. And oftentimes they're fairly young products of our institutions. How would you expect them to do that? They haven't a clue.
Yeah,
And then when they do get a clue, the first thing they say is, I don't have time. But they don't realize it is really relatively simple in a small company to do this.
But I think another interesting observation on what people should and shouldn't know, Merck was talking about, well, technically trained people have an edge in this sort of thing. Well, I've worked for a guy who has a PhD in mathematics. And when I say, okay, he understands variance. But how many times have I seen him look at a result and attribute some special cause to a failure and say, gee, we've had too many substation fires this year. We've had 6. Now, last year we only had 1. Now, what the hell's wrong? Get out there and find out why we had 6 substation fires. Well, what really needs to be done is somebody has to go back and get 20 years of data or 10 years of data and find out whether 1 and 6 are within the normal variance. In this particular example, a real example, they're within the normal variance. So the question is not what caused 6, which is what this guy sent the organization off to do, but are we satisfied with an average of 3.5 because the system's stable, it's under control, it produces 3.5 substation fires a year. And if you're not satisfied with 3.5, don't think you can tweak the system. You've got to do something that's fundamental. That's the nice thing about what I call step change, is you know when you've got hold of it because it's clearly different.
Do you think most engineering firms are management ill, which are highly technical?
Say again.
Do you think most engineering firms, which do a lot of engineering and scientific work, do you think they're slightly management ill, like they don't have good management?
Management ill?
Like, say, compared to other companies.
No, I think they're good ones.
No,
You know.
I don't think you can draw a conclusion that way.
I think they have the same kind of mix as most companies. They got some good ones and some bad ones.
Are they leadership ill?
Well, I think many companies are leadership ill. And I think you're starting to see examples where it truly does start at the top. But those are fairly rare still in American corporations. You know, you could look at Motorola, you could look at Xerox, GE, if you can take Jack Welch's approach, Hewlett Packard, some that you could say truly this is a top-down initiative. But mostly it's bubble up. Somewhere in the middle of the company, something takes hold. Exxon's an interesting example. They had chemicals was the first one to really launch into the quality process about 8 years ago. And they started sponsoring a conference, the Total Quality Awareness Conference. The first one had 40 people, all chemicals. Now they did that every year. How many attended the last one? 2,000, all from within the company, but mostly middle management type people. However, they're now getting speakers for the conference from absolutely senior management. And by that tactic, we're starting to suck them in. And it's certainly the results. I know one stewardship report I gave to the Exxon board was 31-liners, just like I quoted a few of them to you earlier. It said, you don't have to know the process. All you have to know is that the quality approach produced these results. These are all bottom line numbers. Well, that's what impresses them. Then they start saying, gee, how do we do that? But it's slow. It's really slow. And I don't know what it takes to make a believer. I became a believer by seeing the productivity of people go up dramatically and seeing how much easier my job was when they were so damn productive. It's pretty easy to go talk about your results when they're good. When you have to fabricate something and make it look better than it is, that's what's tough.
I would like to comment on the question about applying some of the things David talked about to academia. And these are comments from a person who's spent, up until the last few years, all of his life in technology management and government and industry until I came here and joined the faculty a few years ago. And I might say, David, that I really think I've been involved in organizations that have practiced what you were talking about. And I think in recent years we are, in a very small way, teaching a little bit of what you're talking about in some of the Merck's programs. I think the difficulty of changing what the university does to get some of those things across is not an organizational problem at the university. I think it goes back to the culture of the university and the character of the faculty. It is very fundamental, and just to illustrate what I mean, if I take your simple chart of alignment versus freedom to act, in my experience is we are operating on the abscissa in universities with zero alignment and infinite freedom to act.
Well, but you have a strategy. You've put together strategic plan 1 and
I understand.
and performed against
I'm
it.
talking about, though, at the troop level, namely at the faculty level. The reward system in universities is and I'm getting in a lot of trouble when I talk like this with my colleagues.
But you're retired now.
But yeah, right. The tenure system, I believe, is fundamental ill in American education.
Yeah, I think I agree that the difficulty in education, see, you have strategies, you've written them down. Problem is, you haven't got some of the more challenging, important strategies that would allow you to
We
better...
haven't empowered the faculty. We haven't empowered our employees, David.
Yeah, that's right.
And using your terminology.
And I think and sometimes empowerment left generalized, and that's why I come back to you've got to lay out a structure. I've heard Dick say many times that he's here to serve the faculty. Well, that's fine in some areas, but in terms of the leadership areas, that can't be. I mean, the guy that's positioned to make this happen has got to make it happen. And so, now he may not have everything he needs. He's going to get a lot of help from a lot of people, but that's where the impetus has to come. And I think what gives me hope is there's a fairly common thread of dissatisfaction running through the faculty. But it's still such an enormous amorphous problem. And look, I first to admit, this is a lot tougher nut to crack than I've ever tackled.
I can assure you it is.
Yeah.
I think the dissatisfaction runs more through the customers,
Well,
our students and their employers, than it does through the faculty.
right, and I think that...
But here's a case where the customer is, I think, blind, and we have not been responsible.
Well, or no, I don't think the customer's as blind as you think. That they, now we've listened to it, and Dick, bless his soul, he brings the students in and lets them talk. And I don't guess they get killed when we leave, but...
They may not graduate.
Yeah, that's what I meant. But they're pretty savvy about what good teaching ought to look like. Now, not as savvy as we're hoping for, that you really start delivering a lot of things that they wouldn't even imagine, but would make I think, get into Thanasi's holy grail area, which is how about really enthusiastic learners out there? Well, the reason they're not so enthusiastic is we haven't quite got the way to teach them the subject matter that turns them on. Now, if you could, if maybe some of these other components would liven it up and turn them on, you accomplish that while you're delivering subject matter. And I think there are a lot of other intriguing ideas, but you're going to have to take this and break it down into, you've got thousands of processes and systems, and you sometimes have to start with trivial ones just to let people get the feel. So you tell them, where's your hassle? Go get a team together. See if you can come up with a fix. See if you can analyze the processing system. See if you can get it improved. See if you can put it on the track to continuous improvement, and start at it. And if you can start and work through those, you got the rest of your careers to do it. Eventually it'll happen. But you got to have a vision of what you're after. You don't yet have a strategy to create a different teaching learning paradigm.
No, we do have a strategy. The question is, can we? We do have a strategy.
Don, I just want to make a comment. I'm not sure, from my contemplation of this, that I agree with you that the tenure is the problem. I would say rather, it's not tenure per se, but it is the requirements that are laid on to achieve tenure that I think is a much more vexing problem. Because the time I've spent here is, I think it's very interesting to look around and see the difference in receptivity, the difference in what I would call awareness of other things between young faculty who are striving for tenure and faculty who have achieved tenure.
Oh, that's my point.
But tenure
You
per
should
se
never
is not
achieve,
bad.
you should never achieve tenure.
Well, I would say that might be one of the greatest motivating factors you could ever have.
Well, but it turns the reward system. I mean, that's the problem. I mean,
It's
the
the
reward
method
for
of
faculty is
obtaining
to
it.
achieve tenure. Now, once you've achieved tenure, that's it.
Well,
There's no incentive to
But
change.
it's what you're rewarding is what you're really
but
saying.
I don't think that the
People in corporations tell me, Don, that they have de facto tenure almost as much as we have tenure.
Well,
And I think that whole argument is specious, although I'd be delighted not to have tenure. No,
No, but you'd probably like to look at the requirements for tenure and alter them.
I think that the problem with the requirements for tenure is that while they're explicitly stated as symmetrical between teaching and research, few of us believe it.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
I
practice
think it
versus
should not be
preaching.
forgotten, yes, I think it should not be forgotten that tenure is not a situation. I mean, I know that there are problems that people feel parked, but the point of tenure is not job security. The point of tenure is to prevent people who are supposedly searching for the truth from having to be sycophantic. That's the point of tenure.
Yeah, and it's
But
that point is much more apt in non-technical disciplines.
Possibly. The temptation to go with the fashions of the day must be very great if you're still waiting for awards.
I'm wondering, for a question for David Clare, it sounds as if in business you're suggesting, or hinting at least, that the reward system moves from the $1,000, which probably pleases a lot of people, to something even more pleasing in the long term, which is job satisfaction and a sense of participation and all these other things. And now a question's been raised about what kind of reward system can possibly work for the professors. What kind of...
Well, I guess
Still
what I'm saying is that the reward system comes after you've decided what you want to reward, and that's why I'm saying there's a logical order to this. And until you've got your mission, values, goals, and strategies all agreed, you don't really have a basis to structure a reward system. And once you do that, don't keep the old reward system without looking at it carefully. So if we, for instance, said we think undergraduate teaching deserves higher priority, and not just lip service, but in fact, and that you get a lot of organizations saying, if you don't start doing that, we're not going to even sponsor your research because we think that's counterproductive. So I think then you say, if undergraduate teaching is going to have a higher priority, then you have to reward it. You have to structure ways to do that, formal and informal. And that's what it's not that we don't have a reward system, and it's fairly good, but that we may not be rewarding what we really want to have happen. And it's all kind of, right now it's kind of loosey-goosey, you know. It's when you tighten it up.
Well, I guess what I feel,
Engineering.
at least in our Herbst program, what we're trying to do is bypass the question of how can we change the reward system of the entire university so that eventually, 15 years from now, undergraduates finally reap some of the benefit. It's just the question of tenure and the question of reward for professors seems to be ongoing, and it's a slow-moving dinosaur, so we're just trying to work on a small number of students and maybe change in them a sense of reward. But it's hard because it's still within the context of the university. So,
You mean in terms of, right now, your reward is primarily in a
job
formal
satisfaction.
sense?
Job satisfaction and participation in the group.
Right, and
Peer evaluation.
grades is the way
Yeah,
you get
that's
rewarded.
that's the unpleasant
Strokes,
part of it.
strokes from your instructors, strokes from your colleagues.
She's part of the Herbst program.
Yeah, who recognize that you made a contribution to a team, for instance. So there are a lot of informal reward systems that make you feel good. And I think that's just but what they're rewarding, let's say when you talk to your colleagues in the Herbst program, they're tending to give each other kudos on the basis of what they're learning in the class, the things they believe in. And so you're developing kind of a reward system all your own. Well, fine. What you'd like to do is spread that, but each, as you take in a larger and larger universe, you change the reward system in a whole variety of ways.
However, this, as such a thing, for instance, and since I can speak for that, gets larger and larger, the limits that you meet is the different clienteles that you have to meet. The requests that are made are very different, and most of the pressures take the form, we need to know many more things. And the normal response, also the expected response, is an additive one. You have to do this and that and that and that. And what is expected is to cover. It is to cover more and more and more. Now, there is no way in which you can keep covering things. What you have to do is restructure, rethink, and do things in a different way, which is, of course, what you suggest when you speak of a new paradigm.
Yeah.
But the temptation of saying we need that and that and that as well makes for these piles that, of course, keep sliding down further and further and get flatter and flatter.
I transferred here from UCCS, University of Colorado Springs, and they had a rather effective system when it came to the idea of professors and the quality of teaching for undergraduates. The students would make an evaluation, and what happened was the professors paid 10% of it depended on the student's evaluation. And when the program first started, needless to say, there were some very squirmish professors at first. But you saw over time that it became rather dramatic, and people were actually worried because it was directly related to their paycheck.
Yeah, and that's...
I don't know if they've got it here or not.
Well, tempting professors to flatter the students is an interesting way of approaching it. But,
You know, if we're paying attention to our customers, we better shut this thing down.
yes. Before I thank you all for coming here, I would like to point out to you all that those of you who have had the opportunity to see both of our first presentations, you can see what a wide arc of things we cover, how broad this reaching out is, and we will continue to do so. I do not hope that in the end we will manage to build a dome with all these arches, but I think we'll manage a pretty decent gazebo. Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you all for coming.